McCart. I direct the Oregon TBI teams at the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training. This is funded through the Department of Education for you guys. So the state of Oregon orchestrates and coordinates a TBI team for the state, and I direct that. We are housed at the University of Oregon. Little bit about me. I have been a lifetime educator. I started as a one-on-one aide for children with autism when I was 18 years old, worked all the way through all kinds of systems. I was a behavior consultant. I was a self-contained behavior teacher. I was a special ed teacher. I was a school administrator, meaning I've scrubbed dishes in the kitchen, taken out the trash, and done teacher evaluations all in the same hour. So shortly after that, I decided I wanted to get back into the special ed world and found the Center on Brain Injury Research and Training and have kind of developed a specialty in TBI. So that is me. A little bit about the center. We were established in 1993. We started at Western Oregon University, and gosh, I think 6 years ago, we moved to the University of Oregon. Our big emphasis is promising practices and evidence-based practices for students with TBI. We conduct research and training to improve the lives of children and adults with TBI and orchestrate the Oregon TBI team. So that's a little bit about us, a little bit about the TBI team. So you all are new members or members that started last year that are getting going on this. So I want to make sure that you have a little bit of a background about the team. So the team is divided into 9 regions, and those 9 regions each have a regional liaison. So if you're from Central Oregon, your liaison is Sue Hayes. If you're from Eastern Oregon, you have Tanya as your liaison. If you are from Southern Oregon, likely you have Aggie or Agnes Wolf as your liaison, and so on. Underneath each of those liaisons are team members. So we create a team in each region that becomes the kind of the go-to people for when a student has a brain injury. Some of the services that we provide are consultation, attending IEP meetings, creating materials. Amanda does a lot of phone consultation with parents. We do classroom observations, we provide trainings. So basically anything to help make teaching a student with TBI easier and to improve outcomes for kids with TBI. Here's how our structure works. So you can see we have the Department of Education, which, like I said, funds this program. And then you have Siebert, who oversees the regional programs and the TBI liaisons. I'm sure you guys will all have lots of questions about how that works, and feel free to ask. Put them in the chat. I can't see the chat as a presenter, but Amanda can, and she will let me know if there's any questions that need to be answered. I'm totally happy to stop where we're going and answer questions to make sure you all get exactly what you need in this presentation. I'm also happy to answer questions via email. And speaking of email, I am going to show you our structure. So this is our team at Siebert for the Oregon TBI team or the Oregon Return to School team. So you have myself, you have Amanda Perez, who you met, and Matt Dawson, who I'm sure if you haven't met him via email, you will. But Matt sends a lot of our newsletters out, does a lot of the webinar registration, webinar evaluations, those kinds of things. Amanda pretty much makes all the webinars happen, makes all of our trainings happen, She, like I said, does some consultation with folks and overall makes things happen. So if you, I should have put the emails in, but any of this team is happy to provide support, answer emails. I'm sure Amanda can share these emails in chat, which I'm sure she's doing as I speak. I just can't see it. So this is the team, and we're here to help you out. So I think, okay, I was going to do data first and then the polls. Okay, so one of the primary things we ask team members to do, there, now I can see the chat. That was weird. One of the primary things we ask people to do is to collect data. And what that means is that when you work with a student, when you consult with a teacher, when you consult with a parent, when you provide training, we want you to log your data. And part of the reason is that we have to show outcome, right? We want to show outcome for money spent, basically. And so we ask you that when you work with any of those students or teachers or do consultation or whatever, that you log your data. So here's how this works. You will go to a survey within the team's website. Can you all see the green screen right now? Man, did you know if they can see the green? You can see it? Okay, then they can too. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to the CBERT website, and you're going to go to cbert.org. Under cbert.org, there is a tab on the top that says TBI team. And when you go to TBI team, you click on data collection. Once you click on data collection, you get this. So all you're going to do is hit the arrow. You're going to put in your name. I'm putting myself in. You all are going to click on a region. So right now, I am in region 5. So I'm going to click region 5. And then I'm going to go down to the arrow. And it says, are you logging a TBI training or student services? I am logging a training because I'm providing a training for you all. And then it's going to be which training did you attend, or what date did you attend this training? So think of attending as providing one or attending one. So I'm going to say new member training, and I'm going to put in the date, hit the arrow, and it's going to say thank you for logging your data. So if I want to do a student, we're going to do this again. We're going to say my name again. I'm going to pick region 5, go to the arrow, pick student services, go to the arrow, and then it's going to ask a little more questions when you get into students. So we're going to log one that I have done recently, just so you can see what this looks like. So we're going to put in the student initials. Let me remember. DR. Did the student have? You're going to check all that apply. Concussion, IEP, IFSP, 504, eligibility, or no eligibility. So the student that I worked with had a concussion. Actually, I didn't work with the student. I worked with the teacher. Student's grade level was a high school. Student's gender is female. And then you pick the region the student's in. This for me was region 7. And then if they had eligibility, you pick eligibility. I'm saying NA because they did not. What actions did you take with the student? I did consultation. Does the student have an ABI? Not that I'm aware of. And then did you do anything else? So observation, evaluation, eligibility. So you kind of scroll through this list and pick what you consulted on. I consulted on accommodations for the student. So basically what that means is their team called me and we talked about the student's situation and we brainstormed what accommodations might work for this student. And so I'm going to click that one and move on to the arrow. And it says, what date did you attend this training, which is a typo. It should be, what date did you provide this service or do this? Mine was yesterday. And then you're done. So we'll fix that typo in that one. But that's about what the process is, and that is what we're asking you to do. You are more than welcome to keep a list and backlog the data and just do a whole bunch of them all at once, or you can do it as it's happening. It's easier for me usually to log them as it happens because I forget. But it's important, and one of the reasons the reason it is important is because we are again showing outcome for dollars spent. So it's really important that you do that, and we just want to thank you in advance for doing that. We always get questions about this. So if you have any questions about what kind of data you might need to log, now is a great time to do that. You can throw them in the chat and Amanda will let me know what the questions are, or she can answer as well.
One of the questions that just came up is we do a lot of short term, so ABI was a new one. So we'll make sure I answered that one there. That's acquired brain injury, right? Mm-hmm. But as you guys have questions, feel free to ask us too. And I would say that if you are logging data for the first couple of times, we're available for consult as you go through it. We're happy to help you with that as you go through. So we want to make it as easy as possible.
Yep, and ABI, I have a slide on that. We'll talk about that. Hoping we have time to get to all those things, but yes. Anything else?
Not at the moment.
Okay, well, feel free to ask. Feel free to email if you get stuck on that. If for some reason you don't have time or you don't remember the link or whatever, you can just send us data, and Matt has volunteered to put it in for you. If you have a spreadsheet you keep things on, or a notepad that you take a picture of and send it to us, whatever, we'll take it however we can get it. So let us know what we can do to help.
Jennifer made a comment to register the data for today's training. So that might be a good opportunity to do that.
Yes, you can absolutely go in and practice with it and register today's training, 100%. Amanda, do we want to run our polls?
Yes, let's see.
So the first question is going to pop up and you're going to click on your answers. And we are asking you, what region are you in? I think that's the first one, right?
That is the first one. So you guys should see that pop up on your screen.
And we're asking that for multiple reasons. One, we do want to know where you're from, but two, to be able to log the data, it's important that you know where you're from in terms of the region. I know we all know what city we're from, but what region are you in?
Okay, we've got 12 of our 17 folks. I'm not sure. I know we have one caller coming in. You might not be able to see the poll pop up on your screen if you're just on your phone. So don't worry about that. If you are unsure what region you're in, go ahead and put that into the chat and we'll help you figure it out. And we've got 14 of our 17.
And that should be everybody, right? Because me, you, and the person on the phone.
No, we actually have 17 attendees right now and two panelists. So I would say 16 is our total that we should get a response on, but I think we're good enough for now. Let me go ahead and end this and you can all see it. I'll share the results.
Okay. So it looks like we have 2 from Eastern Oregon. Yay, Eastern Oregon, welcome. 2 new people from Central Oregon. That's nice. We always get a good crowd from Central Oregon. 4 from Southern Oregon. Hi, Southern Oregon, with a strong representation. Willamette, hello. Region 5. Region 6, we have somebody, hello. Lane County, we have a new person. And Region 8. Okay, did anybody not know where they were from, Amanda? Were we able to help?
Anything in chat on that, so I think.
Okay, excellent. So now you all know when you go to log your data that what the regions mean. All right, so my next question is, what is your primary job role? And I'm always just pretty curious about this one. We get a lot of school psychologists, a lot of nurses, a lot of SLPs and OTs.
And if you did select other, please go ahead and put that in the chat. I'll read it out. Okay, so we have one that's a foster parent and one that's an IE ECSC specialist.
Okay.
And an SLP.
So IE is early ed.
It looks like we have another early ed too.
Yay, welcome you guys. We don't usually get too many early ed folks, so I'm super excited you're here. And we very rarely get parents, so for who the parent is, we're excited you're here. Thank you so much for helping us out. We really appreciate it. And true to form, we have 7 school psychologists today. You guys are gonna love Dr. Ryann Watson-Stites, who's coming on after me. She's gonna be talking a lot about assessment practices for TBI. So, and a couple teachers, welcome. For my teachers, are you guys special ed teachers or regular ed teachers? I'm gonna throw that in the chat and Amanda can look at that.
All right. And then I see over in the Q&A, someone put there also, we have an autism consultant / BCBA.
Wonderful.
For the teacher, both are, we've got 2 special eds teachers.
Excellent. Okay. If you're not a behavior person, BCBA is a behavior specialist.
Okay. And then a special services coordinator also.
Wonderful. Well, that's a good crowd. Well, welcome everybody. Okay, so let's get into the meat of things before we run out of time. All right, so first and foremost, I told you guys I am a teacher through and through. So I want to activate a little bit of prior knowledge with you all and ask you, what do you know about the brain? So in terms of engagement, this is your chance to put some more stuff in chat before you have to listen to us lecture, and tell us what do you know about the brain? Any old thing. What do you know?
Just waiting on people to put stuff in chat.
Nothing here. I'll activate some knowledge. The human brain weighs 3 pounds. What else you guys got? I know this crowd knows things about the brain for sure.
Okay, we're getting some answers. So
there we go.
All right, we've got it's flexible, can find new pathways for learning. It's complex. It can heal better than we thought it could. It's extremely important for all body functions.
Excellent answers. Here's some more. The brain's about the size of 2 fists when they're pressed together. So if you do this, this is about the size of your brain. It uses 20% of all the oxygen and blood in your body. So when your heart compresses and pumps blood, it moves up through your carotid arteries and into your brain. And by the time that same blood exits your brain, it is depleted by 20%. When you're awake, the human brain produces enough electricity to power a small light bulb. So those neuronal electrical pulses are real and they do generate energy. The brain is made up of 60% fat. The human brain is the same consistency as tofu or day-old Jello. And it has about 100 billion neurons, which just blows my mind to think about a number that large. And the blood vessels that are present in the human brain are almost 100,000 miles in length. So think about that. Like, it's this big. And within that, the blood vessels are so tiny and so netted and everywhere that it covers 100,000 miles. That is just mind-blowing to me. So the human brain is pretty spectacular. Lost my cursor. There we go. All right, so I have a small video to show you about the brain. Oh, my cursor's just gone. Here we go.
Underneath the newfangled cortex, the brainstem, the limbic system, and the basal ganglia date back to the mastodons, the dinosaurs, and the first amphibians. In humans, the old parts of the brain oversee emotion and help build memories. They control heart rate and breathing. They also form intimate connections with the new brain, the cortex. Though less than a quarter-inch thick, the cortex is the brain's crowning glory. Among its roles, the cortex is our reality check. It filters and orders the outside world for us and allows us to see, touch, hear, and speak. The cortex is also the human thinking cap. All our plans, thoughts, and ideas originate in this layer. The cortex is packed with nerve cells. About 2/3 of all our neurons operate here. A piece of cortex tissue, no larger than a pinhead, can house 30,000 of these cells. Each neuron has a job: to communicate with other neurons. The brain works by forming networks among these cells. The long, spiny branches of the networks create a neural forest of astounding intricacy. Neurons use these communication lines to talk to each other with electric and chemical signals. Here under microscope are two neurons linking up. Though it may look like they fused together, neurons don't actually touch each other. A closer look reveals that a tiny gap called the synapse separates their branches. This is where a message passes from one neuron to the next. The message comes from here, small sacs that store chemical molecules. When stimulated, these sacs release their molecules which cross the cell membrane into the synaptic gap. An electric zap allows this to happen. Meantime, the receiving neuron has special welcome sites for the incoming molecules. These receptor sites bind with the molecules. When they do, special gates open up. The gates let in a flood of charged particles, sodium and potassium ions, which start up a new electrical signal in the receiving neuron. This simple chain of events, an electrical zap, followed by chemical changes, followed by another electrical zap, is the basis of all brain activity. It's how neurons speak to each other. Here, then, is the key to the brain's complexity. There are 100 billion neurons in the brain. Each neuron, like a bit player in a grand production, processes its information, then hooks up with as many as 50,000 other neurons to send and receive messages. 100 billion neurons times 50,000 connections. It's this complexity that allows us to think imaginatively. On their own, neurons aren't very bright, but put 100 billion of them together in a small space and let them all start talking to each other, and you start to get brainstorms. The trillions of neural networks, like an improvisational orchestra, create new ideas and connect different thoughts in a whimsical and sometimes inspired fashion. It's this impromptu ability to produce new things in our brains that allows us to progress, that quite simply takes us from here.
So that is the video Amazing Neurons. I love it. But there's a reason why I show that to new TBI team members. And the reason is, as you're out in schools working with people or educators who have students with brain injuries, one of the things that is striking about it that's different is that you can't see a brain injury, right? You can see a broken arm, you can see kids with mobility issues, or a lot of times you can see, I don't know, like cognitive disabilities. You can see it. Brain injury, you can't necessarily see. So giving people some imagery to hold on to about what a brain injury is useful. And I know that video doesn't necessarily show you what a brain injury is, but if you think about it, think about the fact that your brain has 100 billion neurons, and that every neuron, when it fires, communicates with 50,000 other neurons. And then think about those synaptic gaps, right? So you have the neurons connecting to each other. What happens if you get a jolt, or that part of the brain is injured, and all of a sudden these neurons aren't necessarily lining up the way they're supposed to, or aren't firing the way they're supposed to? What happens to that chain of electrical pulse, right? And what does that mean for what you see with a student who has a brain injury? And it really helps us to understand why you might see a child struggling, why you might see pauses or extended period of times for accessing information, or those kind of things in a brain injury. I don't want that to go. I keep losing my cursor. Sorry, you guys. Let me move to the next slide. There you go. Okay. So a brain injury. A brain injury is a disruption in normal brain function due to a blow or jolt to the head. And that is pretty much straight from our definition of brain injury in Oregon. One of the things that's unique about it is you cannot see a brain injury in a CT or MRI. They're almost always normal. The only reason you might have a CT or an MRI ordered is to look for brain bleeds. So, you know, imminent danger kind of situation. Here's some symptoms of brain injury. I'm assuming that most of you know these, so I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but just some quick ones that are real common. We see a lot of fatigue in kids, a lot of feeling sluggish, a lot of disengagement kind of things. Headaches are really common. When Amanda and I stood in the back of some classrooms, we saw a whole lot of disengaged kids with their head on their desk, silently failing class, right? They were present, they were in the classroom, they were not engaged for a variety of reasons. So that's what it might look like. Here is just a little graphic we created for when we're working with teams. And for those of you who have spent some time learning about the brain, you'll notice the first error in this, and that is that each lobe of the brain is not necessarily responsible solely for the things we have listed, but generally we attribute those tasks to that section of the brain. So if we think about the frontal lobe, which is where the majority of injuries happen, and we think about that list that's here, initiation, problem solving, those kind of things, and think about a student in high school. So we expect a student in high school to be able to do everything on that frontal lobe section all the time, every day, every minute. They're expected to do all of those things. Well, if they have an injury to their frontal lobe and those things are impaired, how successful are we going to be in high school? We're going to have some struggles, right? So I take this when I'm working with teams and we talk about what we're seeing, what might be impaired for the child. It just kind of gives us a little graphic to go off of. Somebody asked about ABI. So we have a couple definitions. ABI means acquired brain injury, and acquired brain injury is different than TBI or traumatic brain injury in that acquired brain injuries don't necessarily come or aren't necessarily caused by an external blow to the head. So traumatic brain injuries, like we said, are caused by a traumatic or an external force. Acquired brain injuries are things like surgical impact. So a kid who maybe has had a tumor removed. We see lead-based paint poisoning, maybe things from steroid use. Some people who have real significant asthma get medicated on steroids, and that can cause some ABI. Anoxia is considered an ABI. So right now, things like near drowning, which for you guys in early ed, we see a little bit more of that in early ed than we do in the older grades. I'm trying to think what else, acquired brain injury. So basically anything that causes a brain injury that is not caused by a blow to the head. Then the other word you're going to see a lot of is concussion or mild TBI. I try to not use concussion as much because concussion is a mild TBI, but those are pretty much two in the same. So we have a few different types of head injuries. You might see closed head injuries, penetrating injuries, or anoxic injuries. We just talked about the anoxic injuries. Basically, that's lack of oxygen to the brain for whatever reason. Near drowning, accidental strangulation, those kind of things. I guess it doesn't have to be accidental, but strangulation kind of injuries. Breathing things. We're starting to see some preliminary research about COVID actually with anoxic injuries. So what does it mean when the developing brain can't get enough oxygen? So there's a group, I believe they're out of England, that are looking at that with COVID. Sometimes we see penetrating injuries, which are open skull fractures, gunshot wounds, that kind of thing. But the most common thing you'll see are closed head injuries. And that's basically when the brain tissue hits the skull and the brain collide, and that causes the damage. So how do brain injuries happen? A lot of folks attribute most brain injuries to sports. So when you think brain injury, you think football. Not necessarily. That is not the most common cause of brain injury. In fact, things like falls, motor vehicle accidents, those kinds of things are the most common. So sports gets off the hook a little bit. And in fact, most sports injuries tend to be a little more mild. Not saying that they all are, but they tend to be a little more mild than a motor vehicle accident or assault kind of injury. And what's interesting is even with this online environment, kids are still getting brain injuries. So we'd think that, oh, they're safe, they're at home, but they're still riding in cars. They're still engaging in risk-taking behaviors. Ski and snowboard season's coming up. We always see a spike in ski and snowboard season. So brain injuries are still happening. We just need to make sure teachers are aware, because the child who's injured is not necessarily walking through the front door of a school and having to tell the attendance officer why they didn't come to school yesterday. And so we need to do some awareness building for our classroom teachers, because they're the ones who see them right now. So I like to do a little bit of this instruction about brain injury through some myths or facts. So Actually, I forgot a poll, so let's go into that. Amanda, do you want to put up the poll about if you've ever worked with a student with TBI?
Yep, I'm happy to do that.
This is a great time to do that. So I'm just curious, how many of you have actually worked with a student who has brain injury before?
And we have someone who raised their hand too.
We get a lot of people join the teams because they've experienced either working with a student with brain injury before and wanting to know more information, or have had family members that have brain injuries. Yeah, everybody who responded. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, but it's good to know. So thank you for sharing that. So you guys actually know a lot of things. I am sure of it. So we'll just go right into this one. Nationwide, children 0 to 14 experience close to 2,700 deaths every year, 62,000 hospitalizations, and that is when a child spends the night in the hospital, and 435,000 emergency department visits. So the error in this is not that there's 435,000 emergency department visits, but what's missing is the data about how many kids don't go to the emergency department and actually go to their pediatricians, which if you're a parent, and I'm assuming there's a handful of you on that are, we only take our kids to the emergency department if they are in tremendous amounts of pain. They broke a bone, something like that, right? They've been cut, something like that. Or if we're scared for their lives. Typically, we wait till the next day, the next morning, and take our child to the pediatrician that's been working with them for a while. And so when we look at this data, it's a big amount of numbers, but imagine how big it would be if we could gather the pediatrician data. So this shows us that it happens to a lot of kids, and probably even more than we're thinking about. So answer this one in your head. Matter of fact, TBI is a leading cause of disability and death among children and adults. And I just did that slide for you. Those were backwards. But yes, in fact, it is. In fact, in Oregon, every year we have about 800 kids who are hospitalized for TBI, about 1,200 kids treated in emergency departments, and about 400 children and youth living with long-lasting impairments. So in our school systems at any given time, we should have about 5,200 kids. For those of you who are going, how did you get to that? So if you crunch all these numbers across every year, add it up, and then multiply it out by how many years of school there are, and then divide that by, or multiply it by 80 or 85%, which is about how many kids fully recover from TBI, you're left with about 400 kids or 5,200 kids at any given time in the school system. So I'm sure you're wondering, how many kids do we actually have identified? We have 260 kids right now eligible in the state under TBI for special education. So that's about 5% of that 5,200. Now I know we are not accounting for the 504s, and I know we do have a lot of 504s. I'm pretty sure we don't have close to 5,000 504s for TBI, but we have no way of counting the 504s. So my point in this is that it happens to a lot of kids, and potentially we are not helping a lot of those kids. They're kind of falling through the cracks, which is why we are doing what we're doing, raising the awareness, sharing information, those kind of things. Here is a video about this. I'll play that right now.
Traumatic brain injury, or TBI, can be an invisible injury which goes undiagnosed. That's why thousands of children nationwide are struggling to be successful. Each year in Oregon alone, 5,200 youth experience TBI. That means 800 are hospitalized, 1,200 are treated in emergency rooms, and 400 are living with long-term impairment. Only about 5% of Oregon students with TBI are receiving specialized instruction. Which kids have the greatest risk of TBI? Young kids, ages 0 to 4. Teens, ages 15 to 19. An external blow to the head, such as a fall, car crash, or sports injury, can cause a TBI. The effects can be serious and long-term, resulting in physical, cognitive, emotional, and mental health issues. If a child experiences a TBI at a very young age, the symptoms may not show up until after the child enters school. A team of Oregon educators is working to identify students who may be suffering from TBI and connect them with the resources they need to thrive in school and life. A student with TBI might look perfectly normal, but they may have difficulty concentrating, planning, or organizing, struggle to complete assignments, struggle with vision or hearing, seem depressed or agitated, appear to be lazy, exhibit challenging behaviors. Here's how you can help identify this invisible injury and make sure students get the support they need. Encourage students and parents to see a medical provider, talk to a school nurse or counselor about school support, work with the school to create an educational plan. For more information on TBI, visit cbirt.org.
So, whoops, there we go. So the liaisons made that video. Just tells us a little bit more about under identification in Oregon. And it actually answered this question. So once children are in high school, the risk of getting a brain injury goes down. You all know from watching that video that that is a myth. Our high school students are at greater risk than any other school age group. Why don't you guys take a guess at what the other groups are that are at high risk? And I'm sure you have it in your head already. So the other two groups, and people are chatting, I think, but the other two groups are young children, so toddler age. So for our early ed folks, they are at significant risk for brain injury. And the other group is our people who are in the last quartile of their life, so our elderly. Both for similar reasons. They both are populations that tend to take a lot of falls and are both very susceptible to abuse. And so even more than 15 to 19-year-olds are very young and are very old, are at greatest risk. But if we think about school age, it's our high school students for the place when it occurs. So for our early ed students, it's really important that if it was a TBI that caused a brain injury, that we make sure to document that TBI, because as they go into school age, it's going to be important to remember that and have that on record. A lot of times kids with TBI end up with an eligibility on their IFSP of developmentally delayed, and that doesn't always translate into the school age system as a TBI. So sometimes it'll come in when they do their reeval and they'll end up with learning disability eligibility or something like that that loses the TBI. Myth or fact, you have to be knocked out to get a concussion. I'm sure most of you know the answer to this, but in fact, you do not have to be knocked out to get a concussion. Only about 10% of people lose consciousness. I told you the answer to this one, but brain injuries are only real if they show up on MRIs or CTs. You should know that that is a myth. I'm not going to show you this video because we're going to run out of time. So I'm going to end on this and then answer some questions for you. So this is my daughter, Lily. She is a soccer player at the college level, but a little story about her because case studies are always helpful. So Lily does not like school very much. Her whole purpose in being in school, both in high school and in college, is so she can play soccer, which is the love of her life. So if you think about Lily, who in high school, ran about a C average. She had, I believe, 4 concussions. On the first 1 and 2, it was no big deal. Third one was a little rougher. Fourth one was even more rougher, or even more rough. So think about this. If Lily had not gotten accommodations during that 4th concussion to allow her to maintain her standing as a C student and soccer player, her grades would have dipped and her GPA would have dropped, which in the moment is not a big deal. But when you think about someone's life trajectory, that is a big deal, right? Because that injury could have impacted her GPA to the point where she could not have gotten into college, right? So our goal as the Oregon TBI team is to not let a student's temporary injury alter their life trajectory. That is, like, if you had to take anything away from day one as what does it mean to be a team member, I think that's the statement, that we do not want any kid to suffer long-term repercussions of a temporary injury. Okay, so that's number one. We need to help people get the accommodations to kids that they need in their acute recovery stage so they don't pay long-term prices for that. Just like we would if they had a broken arm and they couldn't take notes in the classroom, or just like we would do if a student had an injury and couldn't come to school. So just like that. But let's think about this. I told you earlier that 15-ish% of these injuries, even mild injuries, don't recover. So what if Lily's injury didn't recover in a couple weeks and temporary accommodations weren't enough? At that point, we'd start looking at doing evaluations, gathering information for the student to have a 504 plan. And what we want to do for that 504 plan is make them accommodations that a regular ed teacher can do, right? So access to curriculum kind of things. Okay, so then what? What if we're on a 504, but the 504 isn't enough and the student is still floundering, teachers are still struggling, parents are still struggling? What then? Well, then we start looking at evaluating for the need for specially designed instruction or an IEP. And the goal is, as we're moving through these different stages, for most students, they're going to follow that, temporary accommodations, 504, then IEP. We need to be collecting data at each point, making the whole transition between the different levels of services easier. Now, that being said, some students are going to have more significant injuries and they're going to leave the hospital and transition straight into an IEP. But the majority of kids that we're going to be working with, have an injury. We're not sure if it's going to recover. It's mild enough for them to go back to school. We start to see some executive function impairments, and then they kind of grow into an injury as their ability to acquire new learning is impacted. So again, the goal is to help kids not have life-altering injuries. So on that, we have about 8 minutes until Ryann joins us. I have so much information to share with you guys. 1 hour is not nearly enough time to do it all. So we have webinars. We have, again, Amanda is available. I'm available. Matt is available to help with any questions you might have. I know we have a large group of school psychs on. So if you are interested in the credible history evaluation, ODE has all of the materials up for that, including the technical assistance manual and all the eligibility forms. We have a webinar up on CBERT about how to access that, how to do that, where myself, Bethany Bowers, who's a school psychologist, and Linda Brown from ODE talk about that. And I will stop there and answer some questions if we have any.
We had a couple questions back when you were talking about acquired brain injury. And so while you guys were writing in your other questions. Let's go over those. So Sydney wanted to know, are seizures considered an acquired brain injury?
Are seizures considered an acquired brain injury? Now that is always a question. I just saw Ryann pop in. I'm sure she has something to say about that too. Hi, Ryann. Usually in a school system evaluation, seizures are not considered a TBI, but a seizure could cause a TBI from the external blow to the head. ABI isn't really a category in school eligibility. So if it was an ABI, it would go under other health impaired typically. And I'm going to tap Ryann on that. What do you have to say about seizures in ABI, Ryann? Anything?
I think you're right on that. Yep, I don't have anything more to add. You're exactly
Okay.
saying the right thing. Yeah.
Thanks for the validation.
Yes, you got it.
And then another question that was along the same timeline is, would fetal alcohol syndrome be considered an ABI?
My initial answer is absolutely. It's an ABI. But again, for eligibility, it would go under other health impaired, not TBI. So that is, in terms of educational eligibility, that's basically the break point. If something is an ABI, it's usually something caused by a non-external force. So again, things like I said, lead-based paint, illnesses, anoxia, those kind of things. So yeah, anything on that, Ryann?
Yeah, FAS is certainly something that right now we do under OHI, or under other affiliated conditions, and it would be a real switch to put it under ABI. I hope it does.
Yeah, I mean it kind of crosses barriers.
Right. It's kind of in the developmental disability section of things right now, rather than seen as a brain injury, a specific brain injury.
Yeah, definitely has neurological implications for sure, but yeah. Okay, any other questions?
I am just double checking, but I am not seeing any other questions in there. So I think y'all are just kind of hanging out there. Hopefully we're not hitting Zoom fatigue already 1 hour in. Did you want to take a couple minutes break here? We talked about doing that before we started off with Ryann.
Yeah, you guys, if you need to do anything real quick, let's give you 4 or 5 minutes while we transition slides and whatnot, and then Ryann will start her presentation.
Okay. And Rebecca wanted to check if you were going to share slides. Did you ever end up sending those to me?
I am on it right this moment.
Right. And Ryann, I don't remember. I've had a bazillion emails since we set this up. Did you send me slides already?
I don't think I did. I don't think you didn't ask me for them, so I didn't know.
It's entirely possible that I didn't. The conference kind of took over my brain.
I
But
understand.
if you have them, I would love to have them, or even just a PDF of them, something we can share out for handouts.
Yeah, I certainly can send them. Let's do that later because that takes a chunk of time because it's just a big PDF.
No worries. All right.
There's mine, Amanda.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
I'll go check an email. Got it. Do you guys ever watch Big Bang Theory?
Of course.
No,
You don't watch Big Bang Theory?
I've seen maybe an episode or two, but I know that they got a lot of followers.
So they had this episode where they were trying to get into Comic-Con and they were all hitting refresh, refresh, refresh over and over again. And I feel like that's my entire work life, is hitting refresh, waiting for emails to come through. I got it, Melissa. Thank you.
Okay. Do we have Ryan's slides up? Not yet, huh?
I'm not seeing them yet. You should be able to just share them whenever you're ready. You should have access.
There we go.
Yeah, so you weren't here for our slides when we were talking about who our group was. Melissa, you want to tell her about that while I'm doing this part?
We have approximately 18, 17 people online.
Great.
And we have 7 school psychologists. We have 2 special ed teachers. We have a foster parent. We have 2 early ed folks, a couple SLPs. I'm sure I'm missing somebody.
That's a great group.
It's a great group. It's
Good combination.
Yeah, it's very, very nice to have as new, and they're all new team members, new people to help kids. Best
That's
part.
what we're looking for.
Yes, the very best part.
Yes.
Okay, that has been 4 minutes since we took a break. So whenever you guys are ready.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Sydney, I'm working on converting Melissa's from PowerPoint into PDF, and I will send that out shortly. Ryann is going to share her slides at the end, and I'll be able to do the same process with those later. And this is being recorded, so if you do want to watch it and compare with the PowerPoints later, you are more than welcome to. Okay, I think we're probably good to go.
Okay.
So, Melissa, you want to start with intro for Ryann?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
So mostly Ryann introduces herself, you guys, but I just want to tell you how lucky we are to have Dr. Ryann Watson-Stites with us. She is a pediatric neuropsychologist, but more than that, she's an overall great person who really cares about kids and helps us across all the different things we do to implement interventions for kids in schools. She reaches out to schools directly. It's incredible. Helps us with our Lane County Consortium, works with sports injured kids. I mean, just all kinds of things, with the end result being kids who do better in school. And so I'll let her tell you a little bit more about herself, but the things I value in Ryann are that she's always looking out for the kids and for the teachers. And it's incredible to have her as a partner. We're so lucky to have her here. So listen up, you're going to learn some great stuff.
Thanks, Melissa. That might be the best intro ever. It's really at the meaningful stuff. Yes, I hope I help kids. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Ryann Watson-Stites. I'm a pediatric neuropsychologist. I have a practice with OHSU where I'm in the Child Development and Rehabilitation Center on University of Oregon campus. And there I see all kinds of kids with neurologic disorders and developmental disorders, and TBI, of course. I also have a concussion clinic affiliated with Slocum Orthopedics here in Eugene too. So I see mild brain injury through the sports concussion clinic, and I see the kids who are more impacted over at OHSU. I really want to take a moment though right now to thank all of you for being here. Just as Melissa was saying, that we have 18 of you that are signing up for today and want to be TBI members, your new members of our TBI team. And I think that more than any other year, I am so impressed by that. I'm always impressed by that, but that we have 18 in the fall of 2020 when life just feels so hard and we're all burned out from all the layers of all the things, and that you guys are taking on leadership roles in your communities and taking on more stuff to help more kids is just very impressive and impactful for me. So thank you for being here, and I'm really thankful that you're out there. This format is going to be a challenge for me. You're going to have to help me, and Amanda's going to have to help me keep on target. I'm usually a walker and a hand talker and and a discussion all the time person. But we talked about how Amanda and I talked about how just holding questions until scheduled discussion breaks would be the most helpful way to do it in this online format. And we'll take another real sort of stretch break about halfway through. So Amanda will help track me. So I'm going to talk about sort of TBI 101, assessment of TBI. And we always, wherever I go, I need to start out with new people talking about what neuropsychology is, because I'm a neuropsychologist and that's always the first question. So let's just start there. I'm going to talk about who is a neuropsychologist. I'm then going to talk about assessment of TBI, what the thinking effects of brain injury are, and then we're going to focus in on one specific category of thinking, executive function, and really delve into what that looks like, why it's important, what it looks like in school, how we test for it and assess for it. And then Melissa already talked about eligibility, but we'll kind of spot back through there a little bit and talk about associated conditions. So let's first talk about neuropsychology and what is neuropsychology. So as a neuropsychologist, I study brain behavior relationships, and my specialty is how thinking is impacted by neurologic injury and disease. So I see a lot of kids with epilepsy. I see a lot of kids with brain tumors and genetic disorders, not just TBI. And what I do, there are neuropsychologists who do treatment and a lot of rehab. I do some of those things, but I especially specialize in testing and assessment. So I use standardized norm reference measures to quantify thinking ability, much like the school psychologists do who are here today. Neuropsychological assessment is more than just tests. A lot of the tests that I give are exactly the same as what the school psychologists give and what clinical psychologists give, counseling psychologists give. Neuropsychology has no jurisdiction over tests. We have no jurisdiction over types of thinking. Our specialty is that we have advanced training in medicine and neurology and understand how thinking and behavior are impacted by medical conditions. And so we really are trained to take a look at complex data sets for thinking and understand what part of the data is related to medical conditions. Neuropsychologist, if somebody is defining themselves as a neuropsychologist, you are talking to somebody who is at the doctorate level, has a PhD in psychology or clinical neuropsychology, and we have specialized postdoctoral training. We do a lot of other stuff also, of course. And pediatric neuropsychology is a subspecialty of neuropsych, so that means that I have a 2-year pediatric fellowship after general training. When you are looking for a neuropsychologist, the best way to do it is through our neuropsych boards. So most neuropsychologists also, in addition to state licensures and national licensures, we take a board certification, just like your primary care doctor does, just like surgeons do, just like other medical professions do. And so we have a board certification process and we have a webpage. So if you're looking for somebody like me in your area, get onto the webpage and take a look. In Oregon, when I first started practicing in Oregon 13 years ago, there were a couple of us in Portland, and then basically I was the only one for kids south of Portland. That has changed. There's now a cluster of people in Portland, quite a few. Well, you know, by quite a few, it's still maybe under 10, but there are multiples of us, and that there are others in other parts of the state too. So the board website is a good place to start if looking for somebody like me. So that's my intro to what neuropsychology is. If you have any more questions about neuropsychology and how to find us, let's talk about that in a little bit. Right now, let's go on to assessment of traumatic brain injury. So something that's complex about traumatic brain injury is that the effects of brain injury are highly variable. And so you can see one kid with a TBI that is a very different presentation than another kid with TBI. And so it's hard just going off the history of TBI to know what to expect in your classroom. The cognitive effects or thinking effects of traumatic brain injury can differ due to the age when a child had an injury and what their age is now in terms of effects, and then the severity and location of the injury. So when I'm talking about diffuse injury, I'm talking about an injury that's throughout the brain. A concussion is a diffuse injury versus a focal type of injury. So an injury that impacts one part of the brain. So severity and location of the injury can have a big effect on what kinds of thinking and behavior differences you see following a brain injury. When I'm talking about thinking, I'm thinking about these domains, and these are the domains that neuropsychologists will assess. I'm thinking about intellectual abilities, so reasoning abilities. I'm thinking of attention and executive function. I'm thinking of memory, I'm thinking of language, I'm thinking of visual spatial ability, psychomotor skills, and of course, academic abilities also. Let's talk about how brain injury impacts these different thinking domains. IQ deficits are pretty rare actually following a brain injury unless the brain injury is severe, and we define severe as a kid who has had a coma for more than 24 hours. IQ impact is most often seen after a diffuse injury, so injuries that impact the brain as a whole rather than just a specific part of the brain. And the impact of TBI can be most seen in thinking when a kid has their TBI before the age of 3. And so our little kids where their brains are developing so quickly and so fast during that time period, if they have a brain injury during those early years, we can see an impact on IQ. For the school psychologists out there, when thinking about IQ and thinking about IQ impact, nonverbal fluid reasoning type tasks are more impacted than verbal intellectual abilities. And so you can see that profile on IQ tests, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. Processing speed is the most susceptible IQ index to impact after TBI, including mild TBI. Memory is often reported as a concern after brain injury, especially for more severe brain injuries. People report problems with learning and recall and difficulty gaining new information and then being able to retain new information. You can see some memory impact right around the injury and lots of injuries. And then you can even see some impact branching back in the past. And so you can see impact to memory going forward too, so learning new things. And that pattern of memory depends a lot on the type of brain injury that somebody experienced. Though people commonly talk about memory problems, it's actually problems with attention and executive function that are the most frequent complaint among children with traumatic brain injury. And there's a couple reasons for this. One is just how the brain is in our skulls and the neuroanatomy of the brain and the neuroanatomy of the types of skills that underlie attention and executive function. So neuroanatomy plays a part here, and pattern of development plays a part here. And let's, just for fun, take a look at both of those in a little more depth. So neuroanatomy of executive function. If you get a neuropsychologist on your panel, you have to talk about neuroanatomy. So this is going to be a quick look at neuroanatomy of executive function. Here's a picture of our brain, and I'm talking about the yellow part when I'm talking about executive function. So executive function experts will tell you that you need the whole brain, the entire brain, to have good executive function. You need the whole brain talking to each other efficiently and productively, and that executive function isn't just related to one tiny piece, but yet it turns out that when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of executive function research, yes, it's the whole brain, but it also, we get more into the prefrontal area. So the frontal lobe of the brain, and specifically this really prefrontal area, is underneath all of our attention and executive functions. So injury to that area can cause attention and executive dysfunction. And it turns out that the frontal lobes are the most susceptible to traumatic brain injury. And the reasons for that, well, let's prove that first. So this is a big group multi-center study where they looked at kids' MRIs, so pictures of their brains following traumatic brain injuries, and they layered all these MRIs on top of each other. And the parts in red are the parts that were most commonly impacted by traumatic brain injuries. So you can see it's right there at the front. And the reason for that is that we have what we refer to as these bony protuberances around your eyes in your skull. And so when your head hits the front of your skull and your brain jostles the front of the skull, it gets into these protuberances and gets bruised. And so we have more injuries to the frontal lobe than we do to other areas. So that's the neuroanatomy of why attention and executive function is most impacted during TBI, because attention and executive function is highly reliant on the front part of our brain, and the front part of our brain gets injured easily because of those bony protuberances in our skull. But also another reason is development. And when a kid has their brain injury and where they are in development, turns out that the frontal lobes are the last to develop. Our brain develops back to front. And injuries are most impactful when development is interrupted. So you can see the most impact from an injury when the injury happens while a part of the body, including the brain, is developing. And so kids, their frontal lobes are still developing, and when they get a brain injury, you can see more impact on attention and executive function because of that function of how the brain develops from back to front. The rate of cognitive development is most rapid until about age 9, followed by deceleration. So most of us peaked back when we were 14 and 16 in terms of how fast we were able to think, and how sort of fluidly we were able to think, and flexibly able to think. It doesn't mean that our vocabulary stopped at 16. It doesn't mean that our executive function stopped at 16. Executive function actually continues into our 20s. And that's because even beyond our gray matter, or the brain cells themselves, white matter, the connections between neurons continues to get more complex and continues to grow into our 20s. And so executive function actually keeps developing into our 20s. This is a slide showing our executive function parts in terms of our whole brain, but especially the frontal lobes. You can see how things get more myelinated, more connected over time as the brain grows up. So it's a good point to stop and see if there are any questions about neuropsychology or about neuroanatomy and brain development and how it impacts attention and executive function. That's where we've been, and what we're going to do next is we're going to take a look at what these problems look like in school and how we assess for them. So any questions?
So you guys are welcome to put that into either your chat or your Q&A, depending on what screen is easiest for you to see and type in. I'm actually looking at both of them, so feel free to put those in there. And I know that takes a couple of minutes to start formulating your thoughts and questions. So go ahead and take a moment there and I will keep looking.
Thanks, Amanda.
You are welcome.
I think maybe there are no burning questions, or maybe just none that, maybe they're so long you can't type them quickly. So write them down, save them for later, and let's keep going.
I am looking, there's actually a couple of notes in here. Okay, so
Oh, great.
Yeah. So for TBI in early childhood, what might effects be in school age years is one of them. And then the other, and I'll let you decide what order you want to go in here, is are there any recommendations for after school in the workplace? I'm not sure.
After school in the workplace. Well, that is a adult neuropsychology question. So, you know, there certainly are supports that we can do for adults in the workplace. And it matters the severity of brain injury. So maybe let's write that one down. Let's note that and kind of loop back at the end.
Ryan, of note about this group.
Yes, please.
100% of them have worked with somebody who has brain injury.
Mm-hmm.
If that helps at all.
Yep. And for people who are more impacted by an earlier brain injury, there are services out there like vocational rehabilitation that help people find jobs and coach, do some job coaching and things like that for people with severe brain injuries, moderate to severe brain injuries. And there are types of accommodations that an employer can be talked through for more mild injuries, but that's certainly not my expertise. For the impact of an early brain or an injury during early childhood and what that looks like later on, that's a great segue to our next look at what these types of difficulties look like in the classroom. Commonly what can happen is that a kid experiences a brain injury in early childhood. You know, there is concern about, of course, their recovery and their health early on around that injury, and then people kind of forget about it because kid recovered and everybody's relieved and life moves on. And there aren't a whole lot of expectations for attention and executive function in preschool. How a 3-year-old, 4-year-old pre-K classroom runs is very different than how a kindergarten classroom runs, which is very different than 2nd grade, which is different than 4th grade, which is different than 6th grade. And so as there start being more expectations for executive function in the classroom and control of a kid's behavior, then we can start seeing some concerns about attention, executive function, and then kind of draw the line, put the pieces together that there was an injury early on. Any follow-up to that? Okay, Amanda, were there other things showing up for you?
Writing as I was listening to you at the same time. Sorry about that. So there was do symptoms from TBI injuries change as a person gets older, for example, 11 years old, and then as an 18-year-old? Is one question.
Yes, symptoms can change because we don't have the same expectations and demands on 11 than we do for 18. In general, developmental trajectory is that things get better or, you know, plateau at a certain point. And so mostly when symptoms are morphing over time, it's more so that we hadn't noticed it before because it wasn't an expectation for someone before, or because puberty turns on. And so there are, different things happening for a growing adult and a young adult than there was for an 11-year-old, where we didn't have puberty and adult expectations. So things certainly presentation can change over time, but it's not necessarily that the brain injury itself is changing over time. It's that all the other pieces of that kid's life is changing over time.
Great. And Jessica wanted to know, in regard to cognition, why are nonverbal reasoning abilities more impacted than verbal or language abilities?
So this goes back to our, thinking about crystallized intelligence versus fluid intelligence. So there are skills that our brain learns and holds on to, or there are facts like vocabulary, like verbal information that our brain can, and brain, like history. You go to your history class and you learn about the history of Egypt, and then your brain holds on to that. And that is a very different type of memory. It's a very different declarative memory. It's a very different type of skill than the skills that we use for fluid reasoning and flexibility, cognitive flexibility. And it just happens to turn out that the areas in the brain and the types of thinking that are connected with those verbal, semantic, declarative memories are less impacted by brain injury than the types of circuits that are required for more fluid, flexible thinking.
Thank you. And then I have
So that's talking about diffuse injury. If you have a specific injury to your dominant left speech center, then there's going to be more impact to verbal skills than nonverbal. So I'm talking to diffuse injury there, and IQ impact with diffuse injury.
Great, thank you. And then did you want to take another question now, or did you want me to hold that one?
I can go either way. I'm here till 3.
Okay, so this question's from Jennifer. She'll probably cover this, but 20 years ago, she worked with her first TBI 3-year-old. And then about 5 years ago, worked with another 3-year-old. At the time, it was stated the first year after the TBI was most important to provide services. Would this be overwhelming to brain recovery? And then to add to this, my 53-year-old brother had a severe brain injury and has been told the recovery would take time and the brain needed time prior to beginning services. Curious about the difference in service needs.
That's interesting. I mean, I think they must have been with the 53-year-old brother. And again, I'm not an adult neuropsychologist and I'm not in a rehab setting either. Or, a rehab treatment facility. So it is sometimes that after a more moderate to severe injury, that people will hold off on some areas of rehab until some things have stabilized. So, until other bodily injuries and stuff have stabilized. I'm not sure what the context is there. What I will say is that then the kids that we see in early intervention, those kids are no longer acute period recovery, right? They have recovered from their injury. They are medically healthy. And now they're now OT and PT and speech language and stuff are becoming involved. It is true, we still say that first year after an injury that's when recovery is the fastest. So the recovery is the fastest in the first month, followed by the first 3 months, and then the first 6 months, and then the first year. And then at a year post-injury, you can get more of an idea of stability of function because you've had your big recovery push. And it's not that people can't keep recovering after that first year. You can still see some movement in cognition in thinking and behavior and some recovery. So I'm not saying it ends at a year, but that sort of place point of doing assessments at a year post-injury is kept in mind because we think that the effects of the injury are not recovering as quickly anymore, and that their function is more stable and more predictive of what it's going to be long term. So we really try to get in there with interventions in that first year. That's still true. But it's also true that you can work with 2 different 3-year-olds with 2 very different TBIs, and so see 2 different trajectories and 2 different patterns of thinking and behavior.
Thanks. So it looks like those were all the questions for just right now. I'm sure there'll be more that come in, and so we can go over those a bit later.
Sounds great. All right, so let's talk about what attention and executive function problems look like in schools. When parents come to my office, or when I'm interviewing teachers about concerns that they have for students with traumatic brain injuries, these are the types of things that make me think that attention and executive function is involved. Teachers and parents will talk about that a kid needs lots of repetition of instructions, that they're highly distractible, that they are easily disrupted, they have more than
Hi, everyone. It looks like we are frozen. So I'm going to go ahead and pause recording while we're waiting.
Little video Siebert made for people to use to help educate kids, and we have that available for folks to use. And once Ryan starts talking again, I will put that video in the chat for you all. In there.
Thank you, Melissa. The joys of pandemic land and cut off from Zoom. All right. So we were talking about problems with attention and executive function, what they look like for parents and for teachers. And I think I got cut off when I was talking about how kids get overloaded with too much information, how they have difficulty with multiple step directions, how they have difficulties with organizing, they forget their materials, lose belongings. And lots of times they're described as inconsistent. So they will know material one day, but not the next, be able to show skills well one day, but not the next. This real inconsistency in performance over time. And all of those things that we see in the classroom and at home are elements of executive function, because executive function is cognitive control. So let's talk about what I mean by that. 3 core executive functions are inhibitory control, then there's working memory, and cognitive flexibility. Inhibitory control is a person's ability to stay focused despite their distractions, to be able to stay on task, though they're tempted to not stay on task, and to be able to inhibit their own behaviors. So instead of doing something, they inhibit their behavior and do a more thoughtful response. So inhibitory control means selecting attention, being able to stay attended, and to be able to inhibit your response to things, to be able to control your behavior. Working memory is different. Working memory is being able to hold information in mind and mentally work with it. So being able to hold and manipulate information in your mind, keep things, be able to think through things in line. So working memory is critical for making sense of anything that unfolds over time. And so anything that requires you to stay in the moment and remember what just happened and sort of project yourself towards the future is reliant on working memory. So it's things like relating one idea to another, relating what you just read or just learned to what you are learning now. Mental math calculations are a function that's really reliant on working memory. Understanding cause and effect, our kids who have struggles with cause and effect can have working memory problems underlying that. Remembering multiple step instructions, so you remember the instructions and you execute them in the order that you need to. That all requires holding that information in mind and really working with it, so working memory. Cognitive flexibility, this is the ability to easily quick between things. So this is being able to stop one thing and start another thing, to not get too stuck on one thing, to be able to transition between different things, be that two different ways of thinking or being two different ways of activities, being able to flexibly adjust to changing demands or priorities, and being able to think outside the box, that sort of flexible thinking, cognitive flexibility. You can see, though that's not traumatic brain injury, a great example for early childhood kids and special education kids. Your kids with autism have problems with cognitive flexibility. They can get really stuck. Higher order executive functions are skills like problem solving and reasoning, planning, and organization. Self-regulation is the emotional side of executive function. So you have psychology researchers that research self-regulation, and they talk about self-monitoring, and they talk about emotional regulation. And then you have the cognitive, neurocognitive, executive function people who talk about very similar things but don't use that language. So self-regulation is very similar to executive function. It's kind of another arm to executive function, and it's the type of executive function that is kind of interfaces with emotion. Executive functions are very complex, turns out. It rules a lot of our world. It is the unwritten curriculum of all of life. So when you start getting into it and you start getting into models of executive function like this by Adele Diamond, it can be very complex, and it starts feeling like this because it actually is something like this. Kids who have problems with executive function end up having problems in lots of different areas. So deficits in executive function impede school performance. And it's beyond just problems with planning and missing assignments and losing materials. Let's just talk a little bit around the types of difficulties that kids with executive function can have, so that you can recognize this when you're seeing it go in the classroom or in your assessments. Kids who have working memory problems have reading problems. And, you know, us school psychs commonly see kids who have reading problems, and the question is it reading problems or is it attention problems? Because it's kind of hard to tell. Kids with working memory difficulties can have problems tracking along with concepts while reading. And so because they're not keeping it in mind, their working memory isn't functioning well, they have difficulties with being able to comprehend the passage because they're not keeping that information in mind with what they just read. And so they have difficulty seeing the whole piece and being able to understand. Cognitive flexibility can impact reading also for kids who are cognitively rigid, who have difficulties with being able to do this flexible thinking, and have problems with inferencing and problems with reading between the lines that can be described as really literal in their interpretations. Our inhibitory control kids, those kids who have problems with inhibitory control, They are impulsive in their reading. They just take the first little piece of a word and they guess what the whole word is. So they have a lot of inaccuracies in their oral reading. They try to answer the comprehension questions before even reading the passage. And so they get a lot of reading assessment stuff, underestimating what they actually can do for reading, and because of their inhibitory control problems, they can have difficulty sort of finding and establishing a rhythm because they're kind of on and off. With writing, our cognitive flexibility kids, you can see them and that they get frozen. They don't know what to write. They have problems with writing, and it's not with the mechanics of writing. It's not with the language of writing. They just can't come up with it. They don't know what to write about. And if they get unstuck, it can be because that they've developed a formula or a pattern that works for them, so they don't have to think anew each time. They kind of write about the same subject or in the same format for every essay that you give them. Kids with executive functions in writing can have problems with organizing. They have no idea how to outline to do an essay. They are disorganized. They just kind of rush into things in an illogical order. Inhibitory control kids can write too much or write too little. They're rushing into the task, again, being impulsive in their responses. And so they can have mistakes or go on about inessential details. They don't have a plan going in. Math is really susceptible to executive function problems. So our kids with executive function problems related to TBI can really struggle in math, and math can kind of be the canary in the coal mine for our kids who are impacted with executive function problems. That math can be the first thing where you start seeing problems, and it's not because they don't understand the math concepts, it's because they're having problems with the real mental load, the real executive function load that math requires. Math is really impacted by careless mistakes. It's really impacted by not doing things in the sequence that need to be done. It's really impacted by missing instructions. It's really hierarchical in its learning. So if you have been distracted for a few days in there, and then you missed big chunks of something that then now is being built on with the next math concept, and then you're struggling more in math. Our literal cognitive flexibility kids can have a lot of difficulty with story problems. They can get stuck on one problem or operation. I'm giving a math test to a kid, and subtraction is the first thing that they get, and they just keep subtracting across everything, even though we've mixed in some addition, we have mixed in some multiplication or division. They just get stuck on one operation and they stay there. They have difficulties with being able to apply things in different contexts. So our cognitive flexibility kids, you give one type of problem on homework, but then you present it in a new way on a test, and it's not the exact way that they learned it. And so they have difficulty with being able to apply the skills that they learned in one setting to this new setting or this new context. Working memory kids have lots of difficulty with being able to discern necessary and unnecessary details, so they can have a lot of problems with story problems. Also, they can get easily distracted by little pieces of information that aren't important to the overall concept of math that they're trying to show mastery of. And they can get hung up in being able to do things in the correct sequence and holding on to information in multiple step directions. And of course, organization. Math is the class that gives homework the most consistently and gives assignments the most consistently. Most math classes give work every day. And so if you're a kid with organization problems and a kid who commonly has missing assignments due to your executive function problems, math is going to be the first class where you start seeing grades going down. Test taking requires a lot of executive function. It takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of focus. And so our executive function kids can have all kinds of problems with test taking. They can rush through things. They cannot read the instructions first. They can not plot out how to best use their time. And so we kind of talked about all of these areas as they affected reading and math and writing, and that of course all impacts testing. And you can see executive function. Kids who are impacted with executive function after a traumatic brain injury really struggle with test taking. Homework, they can get more support, either from teachers or in the home from parents or older siblings. So homework, they can kind of mask their difficulties and keep their assignments looking okay if they have a lot of support from teachers and from family and other support members. But, you know, a test is a test, and it's just the test versus the kid. And during that time, so we can see kids with attention and executive function really sort of flare up on poor test grades. What questions do people have now? We talked about what executive functions are. We talked about how they impact academics. Next, we're going to talk about how we assess, how we test executive function. What questions do people have at this point?
Okay, well, while folks are putting those in there, I think we had a carryover from towards the end of the last one when we paused for questions. So Jennifer's, I think, follow-up question was, would there be a time frame when you might consider backing off from services if the child is indicating more headaches or more cranky behavior? Would you want to slow down?
Good question. So it's always a fine line. It's always a intricate dance around headaches and pain and around mood. And this struggle is real. It is real in kids' houses. It is real in the classroom. It is real in speech language therapy sessions. And it's gonna, you know, it's gonna differ with each kid and each situation. The bottom line is with brain injury and with intervention following brain injury is that we want to plug on, and we want kids getting intervention, and we want kids getting services, and we know that interventions and services work. And we know that when a kid has the room to not engage, that their level of engagement gets worse. Meaning that if we say, okay, you've got a headache today, you don't have to do something. Okay, that might be okay for one day. But then if that continues to impact their function for multiple days in a row, all of a sudden we have a problem where the kid is further behind and further behind in their recovery trajectory, and we've kind of snowballed an issue. And it turns out that when kids are less engaged in life, actually their headaches get worse. So, and their mood gets worse. So the things that initially have a whole lot of face validity, make a whole lot of sense as a parent and a clinician with heartstrings, that you want to just let a kid who's in pain, either emotionally or headache-wise, or neck-wise or back-wise. These kids can have all kinds of bodily complaints also from the same accident that got them their injury, that got them their brain injury. You know, you're pulled to giving them more room to recover, more space, and to pull off from your expectations. But then what we know is that in that lack of activity, that lack of stimulation, that lack of challenge and engagement, that actually headaches get worse and mood gets worse. So our treatment for those things are getting them back in there, getting them doing their stuff, you know, kind of the acceptance and commitment side of things, where we've got a headache and life goes on and we need to keep doing our stuff. You know, we're cranky and that stinks and this feels bad, but we gotta keep doing our stuff. And then when we kind of go through the motions, you know, fake it till you make it, the mood gets better and the headaches get better. That was a long-winded, complex answer. Are there follow-up questions to that?
She says it totally makes sense, and thank you. All right, any other questions out there? I'm not seeing any others that got typed in the middle of that. So
Okay.
I think we're
Keep
good for now.
moving. All right, let's talk about how we assess executive function. So there's lots of different ways to look at brain health and how a brain is doing. We can take a picture of it, so that's an MRI or a CT scan. We can do functional imaging to take a look at where the brain is using its energy and its glucose use, things like functional MRI and PET scans. An EEG, we can stick, as I tell kids, stick wires on their head, see the electrophysiology of their brain. And another way to take a look at how a brain is functioning is neuropsychological testing. So what does a brain do? A brain thinks. So to really take a look at its function, you test its thinking. And so neuropsych testing is one way to take a look at brain function through testing thinking. Whenever we are doing testing, be it neuropsychological testing or psychological testing in more general terms, we are making inferences about thinking from our observations of behavior. And so all behavior is multiply determined. Any of my students, doctoral students would tell you this, that I'm harping on it all the time, that there is no such thing as a clean test of a specific function. So whenever we are observing how a student does during testing and on a specific task, we have to keep in mind that all behavior is multiply determined, and we're always just making inferences in what that behavior tells us about thinking. So, but getting off of that soapbox, our assessment is never just thinking tests. It's never just testing. We draw information from history and observations. In addition to formal testing, we always have parents and teachers complete reports and behavior rating data for us too. So as a neuropsychologist, I use 4 different types of procedures to help me assess executive function. I do tests of executive function, so it gives me specific numbers on specific tasks. But I'm also watching as a student is doing their testing. I'm looking for what we would call process observation. So how does the student approach the task? What is their behavior like during the task? Is there anything notable or different or unusual about how they go about a task? And one of the ways that we're doing that is taking a look at errors and type of errors within a task, across tasks, across the testing sessions. We'll take a look at intra-individual contrast. So for that person, for that kid on that day, how do they do within a test? How do they do across tests? And we also take a look at, how they compare to other kids their age in a testing situation. And then we use parent and teacher rating scales to also put some numbers to daily function in the real world. So individual tests, process observations, contrast between and within tests, and parent-teacher rating scales are all types of things that we take a look at for assessing executive function. So I commonly get the question of what does a neuropsychology clinic day look like? And so I always start out talking, well, first of all, we collect information from parents and teachers before we meet with the family. I function outside of a school. I function in a medical setting in both of my positions. And so I'm not within a school building, I'm in a medical building, and kids are commonly nervous about that. So we start out talking about how I'm a doctor who is like a school teacher. I'm going to be their teacher for the day. I am going to take a look at all the different ways that their brain thinks. So I'm going to have you do blocks. I'm going to have you do pencil work. I'm going to ask you some questions and have you tell me the answers so I can listen to how you use your words. Some things are going to be easy. Some things are going to be hard. I just want you to do the best you can. There's just one rule in here, and that's just do your best. If ever you feel nervous, just take a deep breath and keep doing the best you can. If ever you feel like you can't do your absolute best, just let me know and we'll take a break. So we kind of orient them to the process, orient them to clinic, reassure them that there are no shots or any other doctor type owies. We really are just like a school, and we're really just taking a look at thinking. Do a good interview with parents, taking a good developmental history, a good medical history, and then walking through concerns, and doing a big comprehensive clinical interview with parents and then with kids. And then we do testing. And after the testing, we do a family feedback session. So right there, the day of, I talk kids and their families through my testing data, my interpretations of that data, and then my recommendations. And then parents get a report, a full report of what we did. And it's those reports that commonly teachers and school psychologists are reading, because the reports can go then through parents' hands through that point of power to schools. Getting back to attention and executive function more specifically, and the types of procedures that we use, I wanted to walk you through. Sometimes people are confused about how types of errors might be revealing about a kid's attention and executive function or cognitive function in general. So I thought I'd give you guys this example. The Ray complex figure task is this funny looking drawing. We show this to kids and we have them copy it. And then we come back and we do a delayed recall of the details of this drawing. So they first copy it, and then after a pause filled with other things, we come back and we have them draw it again from memory. So this is a 10-year-old who, after having copied it, we come back and we're taking a look at his memory for this figure, this complex figure. And this is his memory of it. So that looks quite a bit different, and way below what we would expect for a 10-year-old level related to what it used to be. So let's take a pause right here, and people can just type in so that Amanda can take a look. But what are some reasons why someone might perform poorly on a test of memory? Put that back up there, what the figure looked like. Why could that, or how could that go from this to this? What are all of the different things you're thinking of as possibilities?
It's always the fun part in silence while we wait for people to type stuff in. I wish we
Yep.
could see the 3 little dots that show us that people are actually typing. Okay, so we have one that says where the injury is located.
Mm-hmm. Yep, where the injury is located could impact how somebody remembers things, absolutely. So one way that a kid's drawing could go from this to this is that they have true memory difficulties, right? So their memory was impacted by their injury, potentially a focal injury to a memory center of the brain, and we have problems with memory that impacts this. What else might result in a drawing that looks like this?
So looks like a few different responses now. So we have amount of details in the original image.
Yeah, so overwhelmed by amount of details. Yep, so problems with organization and planning and processing.
Also difficulty with attention.
Difficulties with attention. Yeah, this is a big task that would take a while to do. So are they going to be able to sustain attention through the task and then hold on to that? You have to be able to attend to something before you can remember it. If you didn't really pay attention to it the first time, you're not going to be able to remember it. Absolutely.
And then they may also be having a hard time inhibiting something else to think of this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Problems with inhibition. Good hypothesis.
And then a plan of approach.
Plan of approach. It's like they've been in my presentation before. Perfect. Great job, folks. Everybody's jumping right to the attention and executive function stuff because I've absolutely prompted you to do that. So nice work. Framed your responses. One possibility is that somebody truly has memory difficulties. Another possibility is that they have drawing problems. Another possibility is that they have visual spatial processing problems. It might not be memory specifically. It could be any of those things plus attention and executive function. Part of what we do is we flush out all of the possibilities. We look under all the rocks. And so trying to make sense of a result like that, I would give other types of memory tests. So I would give other visual spatial memory tests, see if the kid performs the same on those. I would give verbal memory tests to see if the kid performs the same on those. Are we seeing a verbal memory deficit in addition to this visual spatial piece? I would take a look at what the sort of founding, take a look at the cognitive skills that go into being able to do a drawing like that, things like visual motor integration. So I'm sure lots of you have seen the Beery VMI, and this NEPSI design copy is something that's similar to that. So this same kid who had difficulties with being able to reproduce that complex figure from memory, they were fine with drawing. So it wasn't a visual spatial problem. It wasn't a drawing problem. They did fine on those kind of pieces that lead up to being able to do well on a drawing task. But you guys were exactly right that it was an attention and executive function problem, because when we take a look back at his copy, so this is his copy. The figure was sitting directly in front of him. This is not a memory task. This is just a copy task. This is the initial phase of this test. And you can see how distorted and how different his copy is than from the original. And it was because of this attention and executive function piece that, you know, he's rushing in. He's just without a plan, without organization. He's just sort of quickly drawing and does it in a way that doesn't give him a good framework for being able to remember it later. So he's not a kid who's looking at it and saying, okay, well, this is a big rectangle. It's kind of divided into 4 pieces, and then each of those pieces have a diagonal going through them. So I'm going to remember it this way. He doesn't have an organizational framework. He's just quickly drawing, and then what do you know? If you approach the task in that piecemeal sort of way, you end up, despite good visual motor skills and perhaps despite good memory, you end up performing poorly on a memory test because of that attention and executive dysfunction. There are lots of different tests. Amanda, I'm seeing that we've been talking for about an hour here. I'm wondering if people would like a little stretch break.
I think this would be a great time to do that. So I can go ahead and pause recording. And then how long do you want to give?
Do we do 10 minutes or is that too long? Do tests. So tests of executive function, there's lots of different tests out there, and school psychologists have some of these already within their test kits that they use every day. Things like digit span and other working memory span tasks. A few that I'm going to just show you pictures of are Wisconsin card sorting tasks, the Stroop test. There is an audio sustained attention task called the PASAT. There's a trail making test. There's a Tower of London and Hanoi test. There's multiple continuous performance tests. Anyways, lots of tests out there for executive function. So you'll see neuropsychologists use a bunch. Working memory is a standard part of a neuropsychology evaluation. And you will see school psychologists give these kinds of tasks. They are embedded onto intelligence tests of all kinds. You can sometimes also see any doctor who is doing a good neurologic exam for adults and for kids commonly have a working memory test as part of their neurologic exam. So things like digit span, where I read digits to a kid and then they have to repeat the digits back to me. So I say 2, 6, 7, 8, 9. I just did it too quickly there, school psychs, I know that. And then kid has to say them back to me, but then we start making it harder. Then I do a digit span where I read the digits to them and then they have to tell it to me backward, or I read the digits to them and then they have to tell it to me in numerical sequence. So telling it to me in number order, starting with the lowest number. Another working memory test that we do commonly is, again, with working memory, we're taking a look at how students can hold information in mind and manipulate it and work with it. So we'll do mental math problems. We'll do letter number sequencing, where I'll give them a sequence of not only numbers, but also letters. So like 1C3J, and tell them that they have to tell me the numbers first in order, followed by the letters in order. So, and then there's picture memory tasks that do sort of the same thing. Show a kid a series of pictures and then flip the page and have them point to the pictures in the order I showed them. So those working memory tasks are common. We also do all kinds of cognitive flexibility tests. One big one that's been around forever is the Wisconsin card sorting test. And so in this test, we have a deck of cards, and there's lots of spin-offs. This is the old classic, the Wisconsin card sorting test, but there's lots of card sorting tests out there now, or things that get at a similar principle, where we give them cards and we say that they have to sort them, and we don't really tell them what the rules are. So they have to sort, and then we change the rules on them. So for example, if they start sorting by number, then we let them get that right for a little bit, and then we switch it, and then we say, okay, have to sort by something else. And so then they have to choose color or shape, but they have to come up with new novel ways to solve the problem. And they can't get stuck and just keep solving the problem in one way, and they have to come up with new ways to do it. The Stroop test takes a look at response inhibition. We do something where we show them color blocks, and they just have to run through the colors and name the colors of the thing that we're showing them. So blue, green, yellow, red, green. And then we show them print words. So printed words of those colors in just black and white. So the word blue is written down, the word green is written down. And then we show them this kind of stimuli where the text word is now in a color that's different than the color that it is saying. And it's a much harder task, and kids will kind of rush through it and say the color rather than the word, or vice versa. So they end up getting lots of errors, and you can take a look at response inhibition through the Stroop test. Trail making tests are another way to take a look at cognitive flexibility. You give them this sort of connect the dots, but it's shifting between two different cognitive sets. So they have to always connect the dots going number, letter, number, letter, number, letter. So 1A, 2B, 3C, and so on till they hit the end. So they're constantly having to keep those two sets of automatic information in mind, but go between the two different sets. So that cognitive flexibility and that speed. There's lots of different tower tests out there. And they all take a look at planning and organization and efficiency. So we give them various rules and we tell them to build the towers. The rules can be things like you can't put a big piece on top of a little piece. You can only move one at a time. And then we give them these complex things that they need to do. And we take a look at how well they are doing at planning their approach to the problem. So there's lots of different individual tests of executive function out there. And then there are batteries of tests, meaning that there are test makers that have pulled together groups of these tests and put together one big norm sample for all of them. The nice thing about that is that you're kind of being able to compare oranges to oranges in terms of norm samples rather than apples to oranges. One of these batteries of executive function, a really popular one that is used in a lot of clinics, is the DCAFs. So the Dallas Kaplan Executive Function Scale. This one includes lots of different tasks, including a card sorting task, a tower task, a trails task, a Stroop task, etc. But it's all with the same norms that they got for the battery as a whole. I want to take a minute here to talk about what are some reasons why performance in my clinic might be different than performance in the classroom. So let's think about that for a moment and have people type in for Amanda. What are your thoughts about why somebody might perform differently, be it better or worse, in a clinic setting? And it doesn't need to be a medical clinic. It can also be the school psychologist. They go down the hallway and they do testing. They do digit span on the whisk with the school psychologist. What are some factors that affecting how a kid will perform in that setting versus in the classroom?
Okay, so it looks like we've got some responses right away. I'm going to scroll back up to the top. So we've got in controlled environment,
Exactly.
more structured setting,
Absolutely.
increased anxiety due to the unfamiliarity of the environment,
Yes, yes.
a one-to-one setting, unfamiliar setting or person, limited distractions, also says less distraction, comfort level, and then also distractions in classroom. Ooh, 4 different answers around distractions.
Perfect.
And then looks like last one I'm seeing here is different expectations.
Yes. So you guys got it. You're all thinking through this. Formal assessment of executive function is a whole lot less complex than real world demand. And you guys already got all the answers here. So clinical setting is a very contrived situation. It is not a classroom. It is not real life. It's a one-on-one setting. I am giving instructions. I'm giving cues to the child. I am being their cheerleader and guiding them through and trying to get them as engaged as possible and get them working as hard as they can. I monitor and pace things. So it's a very structured setting. And it's absolutely true. So those things can be helpful for kids with executive dysfunction. I'm providing them a whole lot of scaffolding that is at a different one-on-one individualized level than it is in a regular classroom. But also, so that could be helpful. The things that can be, that can impede test performance within a clinical setting are exactly, I'm a new person, I'm an unfamiliar person, I'm not their familiar teacher. Kids can be nervous. They can be nervous about the situation and just the unknowns. They can be nervous about the adequacy of their performance. So, they want to get it right and they're not sure if they can. And so they can freeze up on things in ways that they wouldn't necessarily freeze up in other situations. So there are elements of the testing situation that could be both helpful or more impeding of a kid's function, so that we get a different look at what they can do than what other people are seeing in the typical everyday situation of the classroom or home. And so kids can do better on attention and executive function tests and testing in general, or they can do worse. I'll have kids come in who who can be described as having a lot of attention and executive function problems at home or in the classroom. They come into my clinical setting and they do great. Or the reverse. I can have a kid that's not an area of concern. They have a different area of concern that they're coming to see me for. And then they end up doing poorly on tests of attention and executive function because of an anxiety layer or some sort of other sensory stimulation, or what we would call a state problem rather than a trait problem. So trait versus state of the actual testing situation on that exact day with this exact examiner versus trait, something that we see every day out in everyday life across environments that can be more general. So can be better or worse. My take-home message here is that the absence of impairment on clinical tasks is not necessarily evidence of impairment. If a kid didn't do well with me, they might do better in the classroom and vice versa. That's why we take reports from teachers, we take reports from parents, we have multiple different data points. And so we try to look at testing within the larger context of how a kid is generally behaving and thinking in their daily life, and how that fits now with how it has been in the past, to get a fuller picture of their function. And one of the ways that we do that is through rating forms. I'm sure all of you have seen the brief, which is a behavior rating inventory of executive function. We're on the 2nd edition of that now. There's a teacher form, there's a parent form. And so that's a way to capture executive function problems through ratings of an informant rather than direct one-on-one testing. So we've talked about assessment of TBI. What we're going to talk about next is sort of the broader picture of IEP eligibility. And I want to spend some time today talking about distance learning and the challenges there of our current world. And I want to spend some time about associated conditions, and then save, of course, some time for general questions and discussion at the end. Before we launch to the next section, what questions do people have at this point?
I'm not seeing any questions quite yet, but as we know, there's often a delay. So feel free to use your chat or your Q&A box, whichever one is easiest for you to use, and I'm happy to read those as soon as we get them.
So one question I have for school psychs, we've got 7 of them. Is that the most we've ever had in one session?
I think
Great.
so. Yeah, I think so.
I think so too. So I'm preaching to the choir. I'm talking to my peoples. But school psych folks, maybe just chat in. What are the tests that you're currently using that you think pull the most at attention and executive function in just sort of your normal everyday evaluation practice in schools?
Okay, so Jean says the WISC, the CAS2, and I don't know how you say those other ones. WRAML, WJ.
Yep, the RAML.
RAML, thank you. DCAFS, brief, CEFI.
Watson is the WJ.
Yes, WJ's got a lot of stuff on there too.
Yeah.
Leslie,
Both WJ Cog and WJ Achieve.
Mm.
Both have a lot of executive function stuff embedded. Great. Yep, so your cabinets are full of all the right stuff. Okay, let's talk about eligibility. And Melissa, jump in here. I know you guys I was joining right when you guys were talking about how things are changing. And so I don't think we need to spend more time there. And I'm sure you guys covered TBI eligibility, and that, it doesn't need to be a specific type of impairment, that TBI is a really diverse category. And so, it's based on the injury. It's not based on a specific function, unlike communication disability or a cognitive disability or a specific learning disorder of reading. It can include a lot of different impact to cognition or behavior. It does, for eligibility, it does require that that an evaluation is done, obviously. So a comprehensive psychological evaluation using a battery of instruments intended to identify the deficits associated with traumatic brain injury and administered by an individual who has the training and experience to administer and interpret those tests.
Ryan, we really didn't go much into eligibility. So whatever you
Okay. So, I mean, I think the bottom line for people to take away is that, you know, just history of having a brain injury doesn't make you eligible for an IEP or special education, exceptional education needs services. We need to be seeing an impact on how a kid functions in the school combined with the history of injury to be able to be eligible. But that impact can be cognition, can be language, can be memory or attention, can be judgment, can be sensory, can be motor abilities, can be social behaviors, can be physical functioning. So it's a very non-specific category in terms of the type of function, but we do need to see academic impact of the injury. So you need those two things, injury and impact. And the neuropsych testing or the psych testing done by the school psych helps with being able to establish impact. Things you would add, Melissa?
Not really. I mean, I think I was half distracted, but I think looking at future impact of learning as well, which you probably said, but that seems to be a theme that comes up with TBI.
Yeah, so it's not written in the code right now for, you know, predicting future impact, but certainly it's something that all of us that sit around IEP tables are thinking about. And, you know, transition teams trying to think what this is going to look like at the next step.
Yeah, and I feel like Leslie has a good question here, so I'm just going to pop in with it. She wants to know, or I'm not sure, should we be gathering pre-injury data as part of the evaluation process?
Absolutely.
100%.
Short answer.
If you need,
yes, 100%.
100%.
100%. So, and the reason, Leslie, for that is that you're exactly hitting on that. TBI is different than other categories, right? So TBI is a change. It is a change in function. And so if we're going to use the category of TBI, we have to be able to demonstrate that there's been a change in function from prior to the injury to after the injury. If this isn't a change in function, if a child has always had attention and executive function problems, and those problems aren't worse, then we're not talking about TBI, and putting them in a TBI category would be a misclassification. Then it could be something like an attention deficit disorder that would, you know, classify under OHI. Or if they're having problems with paying attention in the classroom because stuff is too hard, due to a cognitive disability or due to a learning disability, again, it would be a misclassification to put them under TBI. So TBI, we really are capturing kids who have had a change from a previous level of function. And that change is related directly to an acute event, specifically brain injury. So you hit exactly on this next slide. Yep. So something that makes TBI more challenging also is that the abilities and the needs change with the recovery time. We talked toward the beginning of our time together about how long the recovery period can be. And I was talking about how, you know, the first month is the fastest recovery, the first 3 months after that, et cetera, and that recovery can go on quite a long time, and that a child's educational needs, the need for service, can change so drastically over that time. And so it's a real challenge to teams to, you know, be assessing on a regular basis and have a really good understanding of what the child's educational needs are at specific points in time, and adjusting and changing. Both for things getting harder for kids over time because we're now expecting things of them that we didn't expect at earlier points in their academic career, or things getting better. They're improved, and so they don't need the level of service that they needed before. So it can go either direction. Another thing that's challenging about meeting kids' needs under the category of TBI or kids with traumatic brain injury is that They're, like we've talked about, their needs are commonly sort of unspecific. Their difficulties aren't just with reading. They aren't just with math. They aren't just with social behavior. They can be across many different domains of function, so that they can require a more sort of comprehensive service plan than kids with more specific disabilities. And so that's something that we just really need to monitor and understand as part of the challenge of the TBI category. TBI, when talking about TBI as a IEP category, we're also talking about the broad range of kids that we've been talking about this whole presentation. You know, we started out talking about how TBI is really different in each of the kids that you work with TBI. Some we can make some statements about commonalities, and those statements about commonalities give us a common language that help us put together intervention plans in a faster and more efficient way. But the reality is that each kid is different. And when they got their injury and what kind of injury they got, interacting with themselves as people and with their environments, each kid with a TBI can be different, and the IEP for each TBI kid can be different. So unlike what, you know, if we see a kid with specific learning disability, due to reading difficulties, the plan for that kid is going to look perhaps a whole lot more similar to another reading disability kid is than comparing to TBI IEPs. So it's also something to remember that not all kids with TBIs need IEPs. Thankfully, wonderfully, lots recover and end up doing fine, and they only need that temporary accommodation plan rather than anything that's more long-lasting and comprehensive. So, for example, students with concussions, concussion is by definition a mild brain injury. Most of them recover within a couple weeks or a month. And so they just need that temporary accommodation to help them during that acute recovery time. And then after a month, they're doing a whole lot better and they can have less return to learn supports. If impact of the TBI remains beyond that sort of temporary acute time, then we can talk about a 504 plan and help structure a kid's academic return to learn plan through a 504 plan. And then that could be sufficient and fine for the amount of recovery time that they need. And it's really not until it's been impacted for longer than that or more severe than that, that we start talking about IEPs. But there are, because there's such diversity in severity of TBI, there's also diversity in amount of accommodation that students need. And sometimes we can just do a temporary accommodation. Sometimes we can do a 504, and much more rarely we get to IEP. Distance learning. I feel for all of you and me. I feel for myself. So students with attention problems and executive function problems are falling further behind than they ever had. I'm really seeing kids in crisis in my clinic. And there's lots of different reasons for this. Because kids are working alone in their own silos, in their own home, they can't take cues from other kids' behaviors, and kids with attention and executive function problems and memory problems and language problems, any of the impact from TBI, lots of these kids take cues from what's going on around them. Oh, we've moved on to the next page. Oh, people are starting their tests now. If they don't have people to look to, if they've blanked out for a couple seconds or they've sort of been distracted for a minute or two here or there, they can really be behind in the class. And then that can just sort of snowball to being further and further behind, period. There's all those individualized micro interactions with teachers and with students that is just missing from the online environment. And so, you know, teachers in the classroom, they can connect with students, and it doesn't have to be you know, a big scaffolding. It doesn't have to be a big intervention, just sort of checking for comprehension, checking to make sure that the kid is paying attention, that the kid is on the right page, that the kid is following the class. Those little interactions just aren't there in an online environment, so these kids get lost faster. And then just the level of personal self-initiation and behavior regulation and organizational skills, that demand is so much higher in an online environment than it is in the classroom environment. In the classroom environment, we're giving so much sort of invisible structuring of kids learning, and at home they are required to, you know, themselves log on at a specific time and manage their time and manage their behavior and manage their attention to pay attention and keep track of assignments. I'm hearing so many difficulties of kids being able to track assignments and parents getting on and seeing that their kid is missing, you know, 24 assignments. So it's been a real challenge. Something that I have been having teachers write into and having, you know, suggesting that school staff write into 504 plans and temporary accommodation plans are regular check-ins, regular team communications, even more so than what used to be the case, because we used to be able to get away with a lot of informal, in-building consultation. And so we would run into each other and we'd have a quick conversation that could just tweak things just enough to kind of get us through. And we're just not being able to run into each other how we used to. We're not being able to do those sort of quick touches that help us be aligned with a student's educational plan. So I'm just having people think about, you know, doing regular scheduled Zoom meetings with a kid's team, or even just a couple of teachers talking to each other, or the speech language pathologist talking with the classroom teacher on a more regular consult basis than prior to online, because we just don't have those informal run-ins happening anymore. People have other things to add about the struggles of distance learning. I have some more slides about it, but any sort of things that you guys have found helpful in your school buildings?
You guys, I just sent a handout that Siebert puts out about distance learning with helpful tools to Amanda, who is PDFing it and sending it to the group.
Perfect.
I just sent it, so you guys should have it in your inbox.
Did you send it to Ryan too?
Well, no, I didn't.
Because I bet she could use it for her parents.
Thank you. So
But it provides a whole bunch of resources.
Yeah, everybody sort of, let me just plant that seed, and let's have more of a, you know, as open a discussion as we can have in this sort of online format at the end. Certainly, I always point people towards Siebert resources. All their stuff that's online is so helpful in planning accommodations and modifications for students with from mild concussion to more severe TBI. I want to spend some time before we do more discussion and general questions talking about associated conditions. Somebody in their questions earlier asked about headaches and cranky mood, and that is just right on. When we're working with kids with traumatic brain injuries, we're not just working with the impact of the injury itself, we're also working on the ripple effect that this has done through the students and the families' lives and emotional and physical health and well-being more generally. So in addition to the thinking effects that of course is my specialty and that we've spent a lot of time talking about today, there's lots of disruption to other areas. People with brain injuries commonly have sleep problems. Sometimes they sleep too much. Sometimes they don't sleep enough. They commonly have mood problems. We see both depression and anxiety. And highly variable sort of up and down mood that's challenging and stressful to manage in the classroom or at home. pain, headaches especially, but we can see all kinds of pain related to the injury that they had. And so pain is certainly an issue for how these kids function at home and in the classroom. Activity level, social activity, physical activity, lots of times these kids are more isolated and they're less physically active than they have been in the past. And that leads to its own host of problems and challenges. And so they can just have less access to support. They can have less access to the things that make them feel better, because that their social and their physical activity is more limited. Traumatic brain injury, we know there's so much research on this about family function and how it impacts parents and how it impacts family dynamics and family lives in general. And so the kid that's showing up in the classroom or, showing up on Zoom, there's a whole lot, that whole world going on around them has been impacted, and that can show up in your interactions with them. And of course, kids with brain injuries, we've also spent time today talking about that impact on academics. So in addition to thinking, these associated conditions can have a big impact on life and daytime function. So distance learning impacts all of these associated conditions also. So the kids who are having sleep problems due to their brain injury are having more sleep problems in this distance learning, online learning environment that we have. Sleep is more disrupted because there's lack of schedule. So the kids who want to be sleeping more are sleeping more, and they're oversleeping and they're not doing their stuff because they're spending all day in bed. Kids who are having problems sleeping are staying, because they don't have to get up at a specific time in the morning, they're staying up a lot of the evening and the night, and that can be disruptive to family function and can result in them having less sleep. So sleep is more disrupted is what I'm seeing in this distance learning environment. Activity levels are lower than ever. A low activity level has always been a concern in traumatic brain injury. And we know that getting a kid behaviorally activated and back to doing more of their regular activities is treatment in and of itself. That is one of the most powerful interventions we have for helping a kid recover from a brain injury, is getting them behaviorally activated. But we're all stuck. We're stuck in our houses. We don't have the things that we like. We can't look forward to things. We can't see our friends. So activity levels are lower than ever, which make everything worse. Pain is increased. On the one hand, our headache kids can take more breaks. We used to do a lot of asking of being able to go to the nurse's office and lay down for a little bit as needed to manage headaches at school rather than kids going home from school. Here, they're already home. They don't have to leave school. They're not missing school due to their headaches. They can take breaks as they need to. They can just turn their camera off for a little bit and put their head down for a moment. So taking breaks is less of an issue, but kids are having more more headaches due to the screens, more headaches due to sitting, more back issues due to sitting. So it's exacerbating, this online environment is exacerbating pain symptoms and pain complaints. Families are more stressed. Every family is more stressed. There's a lot of financial stress. There's a lot more food insecurity. And even the families who have enough food and aren't financially stressed, they have all of the multiple roles that we're all balancing now in a way that we haven't been challenged at this level to balance before. And so, the parents that might have been able to be available and more supportive in a different environment are really struggling to do that now. So families are more stressed. I will say that everybody's grades are lower. Everybody. So it used to be something that people would come into my clinic and that was a nice change indicator, right? So we were talking earlier about how the category of TBI requires taking a look at pre-morbid functioning, how a kid did before their injury versus how they're doing now. It's gotten more complicated because it used to be that grades were a good indicator. Before their injury, they were straight A's. Now they're having more problems. You know, that's a drastic example, but you know what I'm saying. Well, now with pandemic, everybody's grades are lower on distance learning. And so I can't use my internal norms for figuring out baselines and where people should be. It's harder. Our assessments are now unstandardized. So we have less understanding of appropriate expectations. You know, our kids are doing easy CBMs from their bedrooms. And they aren't doing it one-on-one with a teacher in the classroom. That is unstandardized. We have not done that before. We don't know what that data means. And it's leading to different expectations, sometimes in you know, just not expectations that really match where that kid is. So grades aren't a really good indicator. And also assessment data isn't, when done in an unstandardized format, is not, you know, fitting of internal norms either for comparison to baselines.
And some districts are starting to drop. They're not going to do their yearly testing that they've done this year.
That's right.
Reliable.
Right, right. So then we don't have that data, and that's going to impact years, not just now. That's, you know, next year when I see a kid with TBI and I'm wanting to take a look at grades and I'm wanting to take a look at previous assessment data to see if what I'm seeing now in my clinic is a change. Well, who knows? Yeah.
And it won't match grade level, right? Because when you miss instruction, your grade level doesn't align with what your performance is necessarily. So
absolutely. And so, you know, as psychologists, school psychs are with me on this, you know, we can accommodate for that in different ways. You know, you can use norms based on age versus using norms based on grade or vice versa. And all of that is going to get harder because we don't really have good quantification yet of how much, you know, what is the expectation for a 7th grader at month 4 at this point in time when they missed, you know, months 6 through 9 of 6th grade. It just, all of our baselines are now off. Another thing that I want to talk about is anxiety and depression. They are through the roof. Kids with traumatic brain injuries and other neurologic and developmental disorders have always had a higher risk of anxiety and depression, and that's always something that we're screening for and we're asking about and that we're incorporating as part of our treatment. And all kids, even without TBIs and neurological conditions, are having more anxiety, more depression. Talk to any pediatrician who's been on call lately and listen to the amount of suicidal overdoses that they're seeing. It's really worrisome, and we all need to just understand that in this current environment, it's a real issue. It's always been a real issue, but that it's spiking. We know that social support of the family is the best predictor of function and quality of life after a brain injury. So I encourage everybody at this training always to be proactive in planning and checking in on families and kids. Be accessible, be approachable, be flexible, listen to families, and listen for those stressors. And one way to really support kids after an injury is to support their families in terms of just being available. And that we can do that very structurally also through our service planning. So we will commonly write into temporary accommodation plans and 504 plans and IEPs for that matter, regular check-ins and appointments with the school counselor or with an organizational skills coach or some adult that is checking in on at least a weekly basis about academics and being able to maintain academic performance and expectations, but also checking in just sort of more generally about symptoms and well-being. Okay, that leaves some time. So I would love to use this time that we have remaining at the end to not only answer any questions that you guys have from my presentation and of course Melissa's, but also more generally, if you have words of wisdom for us and for your peers about how to navigate service planning for students during distance learning, I'm delighted to learn from each other.
Ryan, thank you so much. It looks like we had a couple of questions from a little bit earlier. If this is okay, time to start running this by you.
Yep, this is it. Let's do it.
Okay. So kind of talking back about eligibility, Rebecca just had a comment that it can be difficult to procure that eligibility in the early childhood years due to lack of pre-injury data.
Mm-hmm.
And that's pretty similar to what Jennifer was talking about earlier, that working with little ones is just a little bit more challenging in trying to get that documentation. So do we want to start there? Is that a good place to start?
So that's a great place to start. We always have early childhood questions and challenges for those exact reasons. It's hard. So it's really hard to demonstrate that it's a change in function. It's really hard because it's always more difficult to demonstrate cognitive impact. And so we're really talking about behavioral impact, and then how much of the behavioral impact is due to regressions because of stress versus how much of it is related to the injury itself. So early childhood and getting TBI eligibility in early childhood is a real challenge that doesn't have an easy solution. What I advise and encourage people to do is to just make sure when you are writing service plans for kids in early childhood to document the TBI, to document that history in the IEP records, not IEP, but in the service plan records, and make that connection that there's a brain injury and there are difficulties noticed, there's delays in whatever areas you're noticing delays in. So that lays the groundwork for us to do a TBI eligibility later, even if it doesn't work now.
And I will add that our credible history took effect in August for TBI eligibility, and that expands the possibilities for how you go about an eligibility for, especially for our younger ones, because, you know, we have limited amounts of tests and assessments for that age group. And so you could use some of the tools that are posted on the ODE website for that, in terms of the developmental history and in terms of the credible history interview to document pre and post changes using the interview structure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah.
So Jennifer had also asked, is there a time range that you may generally give for going to recover, in quotes, to needs of 504? Is that a month, 2 months? Is there a general guideline for that?
Melissa, correct me. My general guideline that I say in clinic is if an injury has impacted academics for 6 weeks or more, I want to move to a 504. I want to move away from a temporary accommodation and move to 504 for future planning. And then TBI, the benchmark I have in my head is about 3 months. If we are looking at 3 months worth of impact, I want to then move us out from a 504 and into an IEP.
I think those are generally good guidelines. I think different districts have different guidance for their teams. I think it also depends on how things are working, right? If you have a 504 that's meeting their needs,
Yep,
3
then you don't need to.
then you're there.
I agree.
The hard part, I think, is that our 504 system doesn't necessarily talk to our IEP system.
Mhm.
And so I think tracking of these kids is more vital than ever. And those of you who are school psychs or psychologists, how often do you hear about the kids that are on the 504s, right? Kids get stuck on 504s,
Mhm.
and they
Get stuck in temporary accommodations.
That too.
I'll see kids on a temporary accommodation plan for a year.
Yeah.
I mean, my guideline is exactly what Melissa said. Like those are the amounts of time in my head, but that's just if a plan isn't working. But certainly you don't want a kid sitting on a temporary accommodation plan. That just is not helpful. Or you don't want a kid sitting on an IEP who still is having academic failure. You need to move it forward.
And so what we see is we see kids get on 504s, and for 1 year they have a C average in school. The next year they have a D average in school. The following year they're an F, and then they're just gone. They've dropped out. So without a group tracking that, it seems like we never make the leaps when we start to see a kid need specially designed instruction, because TBI is so different from other disabilities. We see them grow into it, and so that makes the timelines a little harder sometimes.
Agreed.
So it looks like there's still just a little bit more follow-up along those lines. So the first part of that comment says this is different for little ones because we don't have 504s. So would a little one automatically become a TBI? I'm really curious about how much time is too long for identifying a student.
Too long, meaning too much time in between TBI and eligibility. If that's the question, there's no such thing as too long. If we have a credible history of there being a TBI with change in function and academic impact, or developmental for early childhood, or developmental impact, that we can point to the TBI timeline, then it's never too long to get them on a TBI eligibility category.
But I wonder if they're asking from time of injury, how quickly should they go onto a IFSP or whatnot?
So, that is a really good question.
I think the answer, I'll give you my thought.
Yep.
The answer for me is, say a child is injured, you see a dip and you see lower performance than they were. If you don't start seeing improvement in a little guy fairly rapidly, like Ryan said, weeks, months, you start looking at that. At about 3 months out, I would be looking at gathering data at least, and documenting the injury, because the developmental milestones at that age are so rapid, right? So the milestones come closer together, so you'll be able to see them miss milestones a lot faster. So the beauty of giving somebody an eligibility is that we can give them the services that they need and pull it back when they no longer need it. So with the little kids, I would err on the side of too many services versus not enough.
Absolutely. Yeah, I get hung up in my brain with the medical side of things, because from a medical perspective, you're not going to wait 3 months. You're going to be doing your OT and your PT and your speech. As soon as that kid's released from the hospital, you're going to continue the services that they got in the hospital, and move that forward. And if that kid was already on early intervention radar, and so there were already early childhood EC cares people involved, then you want those interventions happening regardless of eligibility classification, because you would have, I mean, they would have already been getting services on the basis of developmental delay.
Right, so then you just change
So then you just change it.
it. Yeah, but if they weren't getting services previously,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that could go faster into the system than a child who's 10 maybe.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Okay, well, I think that kind of brings us to the close of our questions. And I know we are just a bit over time, so I think this is a good place to end it. Ryann, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thanks to everybody for taking on new leadership roles in their communities. Thank you for all being here.
Yeah, we're so grateful for all of you, and the kids are only going to benefit. So thank you so much. As if you have questions, please feel free to email me. You all have my email address. I sent out slides, so you also have a copy of Ryan's email address in there, and you should see Melissa's from her slides as well. We are all available to take questions, and we're so happy that you were able to make it today.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.